for joining us this morning
Thank
at
you.
Lippincott's office in Boston. And my first question, you have got a great, very strong background for 15 years in marketing and PR.
Yeah.
Tell us about your role at Lippincott.
So my role in Lippincott is I'm a senior partner in our brand strategy practice. Lippincott is organized in terms of brand strategy, design, and then also retail design.
Okay.
And so we have partners with different areas of expertise. So my background and heritage is grew up on the management consulting side.
Right.
But when I started to specialize in particular areas, found myself more drawn to the challenge of marketing across industries rather than becoming sort of an industry expert.
Right.
And I think part of what makes Lippincott special is this integration of strategy and design. The fact that we have this close tie and heritage to being part of a larger professional services firm that ties business strategy and brand strategy closely together. But then if you look at the mix of partners in our firm, you have, brand strategists who are MBAs all the way across to architects and visual arts designers. And really the exciting part of the work that we do is integrating the brand strategy into the design and ultimately the customer experience.
Right. Interesting. Now, Lippincott has already worked with a lot of airlines.
Yeah.
How do you see airline branding as different from branding for other industries? Is it any different?
I think at the high level it's pretty similar. I think the emphasis, because so much of the airline, a customer's perception of an airline can be tied up in the experience. That's, I think, the big difference in the airline sector. Is so whereas, in other categories I might still buy a product, or even if I'm buying a service, there's still a product attached to it. The service itself is what I'm purchasing. And so there are a lot of different things that are controllable by the airlines, and then there's quite honestly a lot of things like fuel prices and bad weather that can change a customer's perception of the airline and of their experience, but are maybe not necessarily part of their brand.
Right. Now, so this, what you mentioned, the externalities in the airline industry, many of the times affect the brand.
Yeah.
What's a good way to overcome the challenges, these kind of challenges for the brand itself?
Well, I think being clear around sort of what the brand itself stands for, because let's face it, you're not going to, weather happens, fuel prices happen to a certain extent.
Yep.
But when you have clarity around what your brand's going to stand for in the marketplace and what that means, not just in terms of the what you say, but in terms of what you ultimately deliver. I think particularly in the U.S. market, over the last several years with the challenges in the market, people have lowered expectations in many respects.
Yes.
And so that, being able to sort of set the expectations but then be able to exceed them, as opposed to, being overly optimistic and being able to promise too much and then come up short.
Right.
And a lot of times with the clients that we work with, we're very careful around making sure that the brand promise stands for something that is achievable, it's credible and relevant, but is also something that you're going to be able to deliver against.
That's right. Now, what are some of the examples you can think just off the top of your head on great airline brands domestically and internationally?
Sure. Well, I think Continental is a great example. That's actually one that...
Big turnaround?
Yes, and we did that work going back, I guess, about 15, 16 years ago. But I also think even to this day, they have done a great job of maintaining a focus on the business traveler. You'll hear that in their messaging when you fly on them, in terms of they focus in on keeping the youngest fleet. They still go, make sure that they're offering meals in coach class, and they've really sort of created some distinction and difference compared to the other domestic carriers, I think, and with that emphasis.
What about international?
International, obviously everyone points to Virgin. They do a great job of really turning the whole experience and sort of putting together an experience that is quite different than you'd expect from any other airline. In terms of, I think they were the first to do the flatbeds. You have the bar on the flight when you go over to London, so more of a social aspect. I don't think they're still doing the massages anymore.
Yeah, we heard about that one.
But even the sleep suit, it's funny. I just flew over there last month. And you could see some people who are new, they're sort of looking with some puzzlement at first around the sleep suit, but then they're putting it on, and it's sort of an intriguing way to engage with the brand in some respects.
Right, that's nice. Now, one of the recent projects that Lippincott did was with TACA, the Central American airline.
Yes.
Tell us about your experience working with TACA and some unique challenges you experienced there.
Sure. Well, the situation with TACA was that, they are the El Salvadorian airline. They had been, they I think don't have the greatest awareness here in the States, or we're looking to build greater awareness. They're privately held. I think as that has become, Central America has become a more popular travel destination. Some of the domestic carriers have really been able to make inroads there. And so they wanted to have the brand represent their heritage, but also be able to take advantage of some of the trends that were favoring more travel, becoming relevant to a broader customer segment, not just the traditional, El Salvadorian, for example, or Central American who knew them and was perhaps going back and forth because they already had experience with them, growing up or something like that.
Right. Now, is it true that TACA is actually a conglomerate of Honduras plus El Salvador and all of these different airlines?
So they actually have in their identity, and we'll show sort of the old and the new.
Right.
These five, they're all representative of the five countries.
Right.
And so part of this was, as part of the overall brand positioning change, was to then have an identity update and refresh where clearly it became a more modern typeface, had more fluid, more movement associated with it, but still kept, these are actually all representative of the parrot, which is the national bird of El Salvador, and obviously this still has sort of a reminder of the bird, but and still has the five pieces of the country. So it was not a complete revolution, but it was sort of an evolution to make the brand more modern, more relevant to a broader range of customers.
Right. Now, was the pitch more just graphic and design oriented, or was it organizational and process oriented as well?
So it started actually with a positioning. So I started with that, but the positioning was being very clear on what we're going to stand for in the marketplace, and there were a couple of different options around. One that might have been more about a calming trip that might suggest more investment in technology, and then a different option around sort of greater emphasis on personal service. And so part of our work there was to actually build greater alignment around which of those options they ultimately have moved towards the personal service aspect. And now part of it was then to say, let's change the identity to communicate the change. That's been translated across uniforms, across their livery. They had a large brand launch event that we were part of.
Very good.
And so that has become sort of the guiding light in many respects to how they then think about employee training, the service experience, and really developing a lot of initiatives around developing that more consistent customer experience.
Right. Now, you mentioned that you work towards employee alignment and things like that. Now, was it more difficult to implement organizational change internally or more towards the creating exposure externally for external customer?
I think with anything internally is always going to be a challenge, and I think that's where honestly the rubber hits the road in terms of take the words on the page of a particular brand positioning statement or the identity change, and being able to drill down to that granular level to say, well, what does it mean we're going to do differently?
Right.
Looking across some of our clients, the clients that literally walk in and somebody's got their brand foundation, and they'll sit in a meeting and go, is what we're about to do consistent with what we're going to stand for in the marketplace? And use that as a filter to say we're going to do certain things or maybe we're not going to do certain things.
Right.
And obviously that is always a challenge in terms of building that change. That just takes time. That's something where you start at that high level of here's what we want to aspire to, here's what we want to stand for. But then as you move further and further into, okay, specifically, what does this mean we're going to do? Is this something that we're going to do that is going to be because everybody else is doing it and we need to do it? Or is this something that's going to actually represent the essence of why we're different and special in the marketplace? Right.
Now, in your experience in airlines, is this generally a top-down thing or is it a bottom-up thing?
I'd say it needs to be both.
Right.
Particularly, there's a certain amount of foundational work that comes from the top down. At the same time, you when it gets into what is it we're going to do, honestly, the best suggestions come from the bottom up.
Right.
And that achieves two things. One, those are people who know the jobs and know it's feasible, and so they know that they can actually implement it. And then two, you actually get greater alignment and interest knowing that people are making suggestions, that they're empowered to make those suggestions. So it helps create some cultural change in some respects of people feeling like they can actually help make the change happen.
Right. Now, what do you think about the timing now that the industry is in such a bad shape and there's economic downturn? Is this a good time to rebrand yourself or just spend more dollars on branding?
Well, I guess I'll take that in two different ways, because is it a good time to rebrand yourself? I think that depends more strategically on where you are. We don't necessarily sit down with a client and say, yes, you should think about rebranding. Usually there is some other impetus. In the case of TACA, it was this desire to expand its relevance to a broader customer audience and defend itself against some of the incoming competition.
Right.
So that's sort of just rebranding for rebranding's sake, obviously, regardless of the time, doesn't make sense. Given the other part of your question, I do think it represents an opportunity. What we see, in these challenging times is that it represents a good time to win customers. Not in airlines, but given all the events in the financial services market right now, we just completed some research that says anywhere from 50% or more of customers are looking to switch providers, given all these challenges. And on the one respect, you get concerned and say, well, how do I keep my own customers? Some of the more savvy companies are probably looking at this going, how do we actually go and perhaps win some additional share by stealing from some of those other people at other companies that are looking to switch?
Right. Very interesting. Now, given the current state of affairs again, is the brand more important than the product?
I don't think it's ever going to be more important than the product. I think when we talk about the experience, you cannot separate the brand from the product.
Right.
I think if you do, you run the risk of this aspirational promise, and then the product doesn't follow, the experience doesn't follow, and you're actually doing more harm than good. So when we talk to folks, it's thinking about the product and the brand all together as part of that integrated experience.
Right. Now, one of the arguments that also keeps coming up in airline industry especially is we should just try to sustain operations. Forget about the brand. If you can run your business tomorrow, we're happy. Is that a good mentality?
I understand the logic of it in terms of we need to stay in business. I think what happens is you run into these situations where by focusing exclusively on operations, you risk becoming undifferentiated. You risk standing for nothing. And without that clarity, you can focus on operations all you want, but there isn't necessarily a distinction around why somebody's going to choose you over a competitor. So that's I think something to keep in mind in terms of it. There's a lot of strong operational focus that needs to happen.
Right.
But then thinking about how that actually ties for what we do, what we stand for, and what we give customers a reason to choose us is also very important.
Right. Now, one of the recent trends in the airline industry is consolidation. Delta, Northwest, there's Air France, KLM, Lufthansa is buying a horde of airlines.
Yes.
How do you think airlines can leverage on these mergers and takeovers to build their brand further?
I think being clear, I think the most important thing is being clear up front is this merger being done to create to bring together and say we're going to do the best of both, and so you either get a hybrid model, which is often very easy to say, but maybe very challenging to implement and to do in practice.
Right.
Or having it become something where you're actually charting a bold new strategic direction. We're doing this merger so that we can do something different that we couldn't do before. And then that really gives both organizations a reason for being. It's not an issue of we're the winner, you're the loser in terms of we bought you. It gives everybody a reason for getting excited about a new vision, and it's not, old Delta was like this, or old Northwest was like this, or legacy, whoever. But it's really getting people organized and coalesced around a particular future vision. And I think a lot of the challenges, yes, a lot of these mergers may be done to drive greater synergies.
Right.
But I think that the opportunity there is to say, well, what is it that we're going to do different that we couldn't do before? And what is that sort of one shared vision so that we move past, I'm from company A or I'm from company B, and this is actually, forget that, we're part of the new company together.
Brilliant. And so just following on that, one of the new trends which is just the social media that's coming up.
Yeah.
And there's been a case where brands are trying to control the buzz online.
Yeah.
To what extent do you think that's possible or even feasible?
I'm not sure. It's interesting when you say control. Obviously, that's a little bit loaded. I don't think anyone can actually control it. I think you can have clarity around what you want your brand to stand for, and communicate that. And then I think, what I think the online media provide an opportunity is, in many cases, you get faster feedback around how you're actually doing against that. There are probably plenty of times where, if you think about the traditional, way a customer might lodge a complaint, they might write a letter, or they might call into, an IVR where they can't actually speak to a human being. The online media provide an opportunity in many respects, from a company perspective, to really understand some of the issues. And I think then the challenge then becomes, is it a one-off, or is this something that's more broader and more endemic?
Right.
That's where I think it can be particularly valuable.
Very interesting. Now, let me switch over to the U.S. airline industry for just a little bit, because it's just so dynamic. Lippincott has worked with a number of U.S. airlines. Do you think that they can ever get their thunder back from the good old days of Pan Am?
I think it's interesting. I think you actually are revealing a question there that is a challenge we see in a broader range of industries, which is sort of a legacy brand, or a brand that has a lot of history and heritage, and how well it can be repositioned versus a new brand. Because I would actually say that in the U.S., a lot of the new brands, or newer brands, think of a JetBlue. Southwest obviously is not necessarily a new brand.
Virgin America.
Exactly. Have really been able to come into a market and create a distinction, and difference.
Right.
The benefit is they're doing that from a clean sheet of paper. There's always a challenge of doing that when you have 50, 60, 70 years of history and heritage to draw upon in different market dynamics.
Right.
I think Southwest is very interesting because they've been around for so long and been successful for so long, but even they are running into challenges.
Their first non-profitable quarter.
Exactly, and now you see it in their communications, where they have evolved from that emphasis on the leisure traveler. They are now trying to translate that message to the business traveler. That means a lot of operational changes of, we don't have people queuing up, or you don't have to go and queue up 4 hours ahead of time to get a decent seat.
Yep.
You can actually get a drink. You can actually get some rewards points. So how do we actually translate our offer and make it relevant for a business customer? Because we need that audience to grow as well.
Right. Now, what are some of the critical steps that should be taken by U.S. airlines in order to achieve the quality like Virgin Atlantic or maybe Singapore Airlines?
Yeah.
What can they do?
Well, I think a lot of it really starts back with a clear understanding of who those audiences are and who your priority audiences are. I'll go back to the Continental example I mentioned earlier. They still talk about the emphasis on the business traveler. Obviously, from a leisure traveler, they still are relevant for them.
Right.
But there's a focus there that leads to, here's what we're going to do from an aircraft standpoint. Here's what we're going to do from an amenity standpoint. Here's what we're going to do from, we're going to have perhaps greater seat pitch. Different elements of the experience that are all consistently tied. That doesn't mean that, we don't want any leisure travelers. But what it does suggest is that focus and emphasis leads to greater clarity around those decisions. And then obviously there's a way to think about how do we then broaden that and become relevant for a wider range of audiences.
Right.
But having that sort of starting point of who we're going to focus on, as opposed to simply saying, which is an easy trap to fall into, the airline seat is perishable, so we're going to welcome that, we're after everybody. But who is that target audience that we want to go after, and how do we actually orient what we do and why we're different to be relevant to that audience?
Right. Now, I see this as a double-edged sword of sorts. I was listening to the VP of Marketing of United Airlines in June, and he mentioned that they are very, very focused on their 100K flyers who have done at least 100K miles per year, on their key frequent flyers, and we're going to offer them flat beds and everything else, but then the coach is suffering a lot. Yeah. And interestingly, the number of people who fly coach on United are much larger, and they talk a lot more. They create the online buzz, they send in all the bad feedback, and they're the pissed ones.
Yes.
Whereas United is trying to please the business travelers and focus there, which provides their 60% revenue.
Right.
Is that a dilemma?
I think it is a dilemma in a couple of respects. I think it makes a lot of sense, obviously, in that if 60% of your revenue is from this, relatively small customer base, the risk is, where's that next base going to come from, right? Where, who, presumably there are some people in the back of the bus who are, going to be your next 100K flyers.
Right.
And you want to have something where you're continuing to build the business over time, and not simply focusing exclusively. I mean, we've seen that with some of the airlines, and quite honestly, some of them have gone under, which is the EOSs and others,
right,
where they have only exclusively focused on the premium segment, but that business hasn't been, the business model hasn't been supported.
Right.
So I think it is an interesting dilemma, and I think you've seen different airlines approach it different ways. Delta tried Song to have sort of that separate leisure brand. It ultimately got folded back in, but then they when it was a question of what elements do we bring? The TVs on the back of the seat, having some of the entertainment components, which were good ideas that came from Song, but actually have that be part of the broader Delta offering.
Right. Now that you mentioned Song, here's a wild idea. Tell me what you think about it. In the past, there have been efforts from United and Delta to start Song and just low-cost subsidiaries. Now, interestingly, these full-class airlines have become low-cost carriers, like United charges for food, US Airways charges for water.
Yeah.
Do you think it's a good idea for a company like US Airways to start a premium airline brand, which is all nice and full food and differentiate itself in that way?
I think it's an interesting idea, right? And I think that there's, in the same way that I think a lot of the learnings from some of those low-cost airlines helped reveal important ways to enhance the experience across the entire fleet. In some respects, it was kind of like an incubator.
Right.
It may have been a very expensive incubator, but it was an incubator nonetheless.
Right.
And I think that there's probably an opportunity to think about that. I think with United, if you look at some of the PS service that they offer, which is not here in Boston, but obviously out of New York,
right,
I mean, there are elements of that are that start to move in that way. Clearly there's certain routes from New York to San Francisco, New York to LA that the market supports it,
right,
and that may lead to some potential refinements to the overall service offering. I mean, in those planes, the economy section is all economy plus.
Right.
So, are there ways to sort of look at the high end and then say, well, what are some elements or some innovations that we can bring to the broader, the broader airline offering as a whole?
Interesting. Now, one of the things that airlines are trying to do to recoup some costs are just charging for baggage, charging for water. In fact, I was just surprised to learn that yesterday, even Singapore Airlines started charging $100 for the emergency exit seat if you want to book it. Do you think that there's just too much damage to the brand equity and just short-term gains from this money?
Well, I think it's one thing as consumers, we've probably all grown quite accustomed to paying low fares. And that's the trade-off. I mean, I think people, in one respect, harken back to the days of flying in the 60s and 70s when it was almost a vacation in and of itself.
Right.
Well, we're paying a lot less today, and as a result, I think that we've sort of, as consumers, voted with our feet in some respects. So I understand that the airlines are looking for different ways to build revenue, and so I think that there are interesting ways to test some of those things to see if they work. I mean, certainly there are plenty of people presumably who will pay for that emergency exit row, or will potentially pay. There's greater market information as well in terms of what things people are willing to pay for versus perhaps what they're not.
Right.
So I understand from a business standpoint, and I think the challenge, as you point out, from a brand standpoint, is how do we make sure that we're still delivering against the promise? I think people have come around to, a certain expectation. I mean, my guess is as oil prices have come down and if jet fuel prices come down, that the charging for those different things may not necessarily go away.
Yep. Interesting. Now, let me go on to a little bit towards benchmarking here.
Sure.
So, Interbrand releases this top 100 brands of the year with Business Week. But interestingly, there was not even a single airline in top 100 this year. Yeah. Do you think there's a good way to measure and rate airline brands?
I do. I mean, I think that, as with anything, I think being clear about what you want to try and measure, it's less about perhaps, so much of the value of an airline right now, there's the challenge in the business model itself.
Right.
So when you think about the why is that the value of the business itself is sort of under attack. I think a lot of the measures that, if I were thinking about an airline, are much more around measures of advocacy, measures of satisfaction, measures of recommendation, because that's what's going to drive the business.
Right.
Satisfaction tends to be a bit more of a looking backwards and very specific to your recent incident. So I might have had a really good flight on this airline,
Right.
but then the next one isn't. But I think when you start thinking about advocacy and recommendation, those tend to be the types of things where it actually can help drive the business and be an indicator of, are we in a position to grow? Is there positive momentum behind our brand?
Right. That's very interesting. If I mention this phrase to you, airlines in 2009, what's the first word that comes to your mind?
Besides continue to be challenged, which is more than one word. I think that more, and again, that's probably something more broad to the economy, right? I think everyone is looking at 2009 and saying it's going to be a challenging economy. I think that the opportunity from an airline standpoint is, again, going back to having clarity around what is it we're going to stand for. It really raises the importance from a brand standpoint. If we are in a challenging economic environment where it becomes more of that battle for every customer, and perhaps air traffic is down, what is it that is going to make us unique and different and compelling? Not just in what we say, but how do we think about that across our entire experience?
Yep.
And I think that's going to be the part to think about. Going back to your earlier question, why is it that you would want to think about this in tough times? Because actually, when the times are toughest is when perhaps brands can be the most compelling in terms of giving a customer a reason to choose you over the other guy.
All right. Great. Thank you very much for joining us, Michael, today, and we really appreciate your insights.
Thank you very much.